All right, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, June 25th, and what's going on? Do we have a legitimate ceasefire right now between Iran and Israel?
Yeah, well, we do have a ceasefire. It's held for, I guess, a little over a day, but I doubt that it's going to last long. Now, it's interesting that Iran all along has said if Israel stops attacking us, we'll stop attacking them. So
They've
that's
said
been
this before Trump
yeah,
said anything.
yeah, that's right. Just a few days into the after the initial surprise attack, that's been their stated policy. And so there's nothing new on the Iranian side, but it appears, and we don't see any evidence to the contrary, that this was initiated by the Israeli side. That's what, anyway, all Western media, without exception, to my knowledge at least, is reporting that the Israelis requested it.
Are the Israelis openly admitting it that they wanted the ceasefire?
Well, okay, I don't know if they've actually said it about the ceasefire, but I know that there was an IDF general even before the ceasefire happening said that we're going to wind this down in a few days. So you'd actually got that, which is again an indication. They're putting on a brave front. We achieved our objectives, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we have many reasons to believe that they were in trouble, for some of the reasons that we've talked about before. They were running out of the air defense interceptors. I think there's no question about that. We had that report, I believe it was in the Wall Street Journal. It said that this was about a week ago that they had 10 to 12 days. So anyway, they were probably down to something like 5 days, when the ceasefire went into effect. Maybe it was even worse. And then just I saw a report this morning. I think it was from NBC News that in general, their munitions stockpiles were way down. So we're talking about like the missiles that they were firing into Iran. They were, according to the chief of the U.S. Navy, were being used at an alarming rate. So again, this is something that we've talked about before. It's just looking in the long run, Iran had an advantage, and I think that was true. And this is that they did not achieve their objectives. It seems clear to me that their objective was regime change or chaos in Iran. They wanted another Syria in Iran, another Lebanon, and they failed to achieve that. But they had no choice because, again, uh, right, they were running out of interceptors and they were running out of missiles, and also they were getting punished. We don't know the full extent of it. We've seen the footage from the cities, from Tel Aviv and Haifa and Beersheba. You can see extensive damage. It's the sort of thing we've never seen in Israel before. And it's amazing, actually, how Israelis or the government is kind of refuses to admit it. But I did read an article yesterday in Haaretz is saying that parts of Tel Aviv look like Gaza. We're not used to this. This is different. And again, Israel's a small country. If Iran had been able just to keep up that, every other day do that kind of damage, take out another building or two in one of these major cities in the downtown, that they were going to not necessarily destroy the cities, but um, they were going to render them, let's say, not uninhabitable, but the damage was going to be so extensive that it could not be denied, and that it would be just kind of a permanent, a long-term scar on the face of Israel that, that again, that they won't be able to hide. They wouldn't be able to hide from the world. I don't think they can hide the damage that they have suffered, but anyway, that's all those things add up to, I think, a motivation on the part of Israel to bring this to an end, at least temporarily. I have no confidence that it's going to hold. They did not achieve their objectives, and we know Israel's record as far as honoring ceasefires. I'm sure that they're going to break it at some point, but they're going to, they're going to try something else, or they're going to replenish their stockpiles. I think that's probably their first objective here.
Well, the image that's being presented to the world is that Daddy Trump just came in and said, "Cut it out, everybody," and declared the ceasefire. And the language he was using made it almost sound like it was a UFC fight. He said, "Congratulations, everybody! Great fight. You know, you guys both got in some good blows, but now it's over. I have spoken." But
Right.
that's you're saying that's not really the case. It's really the Israelis that were pushing for this, or I mean, the U.S. obviously wanted this as well, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Uh, I think again, it's kind of absurd. That Trump is pretending that he talks sometimes like he's a neutral third party, right? He's the teacher that came in and broke up the fight in the schoolyard. He uses that kind of language, but clearly, we were on the Israeli side. We were deeply involved even prior to that attack on the nuclear facilities by our B-2 bombers. We were deeply, deeply involved in, the Israeli attack would not have been possible without us. So we are on one side. So this pretense of being, a third party, a neutral arbiter is ridiculous. Ridiculous. And maybe, yeah, you put some pressure on the Israelis. There's no question, but I think the Israelis caved really quickly because just as like that IDF general said prior uh, um, to the ceasefire and prior even to the attack, they wanted to wind this down, and I think we know the reasons why.
Are you surprised that Iran agreed to the ceasefire?
Well, I'm not really surprised because let's say we've been talking about Israel's problem, but Iran suffered some serious damage. We don't even know the extent of it, but I think there's no question that they suffered a lot of damage. Both to personnel and to infrastructure. Um, and they were caught off guard, and they have a problem with the covert network. It appears that they exposed a good part of that. They've arrested scores of people within Iran. They discovered some of these secret factories, but I'm sure they would like to continue extirpating this network. They need to strengthen their air defense. It's an open question, like how good was their air defense? It was there. I think there's no question that it was operating, and it was something that the Israelis still had to respect. Um, the Despite the claims that they ruled the sky, I have never seen any direct evidence that their fighters were actually flying in Israeli airspace. I think I saw a couple reports of that, but those weren't confirmed. And I think at least in one case, it was later corrected that, oh no, it wasn't a fighter, it was a drone. It appears that a lot of these strikes that the Israelis carried out were actually carried out by, you could say, fighter drones that are flying over Iran. And the Iranians managed to apparently shoot down at least 10 of them. And the Israelis just don't have that many of them. So, that was a considerable portion of their inventory. But, I think there's no question that there's some holes, in the Iranian air defense system, and it could be bolstered. A really strong air defense system would make it even possible for their fighters to approach the border. I remember, I think in that attack back in October, they fired from 100 kilometers away. So I think there's clearly a weakening, a degradation of the Iranian air defense network. And I don't know what they can do in the short term, but their own repairs, and they should receive help from Russia. We've heard the reports, again, from Putin himself, that they actually refused offered help months ago. But maybe this time, they're not going to do that. They're not going to make that same foolish mistake. So they could beef up their air defense systems. They could extirpate this covert network. There are things that they can do on their side. They were caught off guard. If it happens again, they have no excuse. I think one thing going into the ceasefire, they should understand that it could end any day. There's no reason, and I think they must understand that there isn't even sort of like a time limit that's been put on this, or any sort of schedule, or really it seems like any particular terms. It's just an agreement, not to hit each other. In fact, again, this is agreement that the Iranians made, or at least they had already stated their position, long before the ceasefire. So they're but I think they understand fully well that the Israelis could break the ceasefire. They could resume hostilities at any time, and not only that, they may attempt to violate it in different ways. We've seen what has happened in both Lebanon and in Gaza. Ceasefires these were real ceasefires that were negotiated and had terms, and then the Israelis promptly broke the terms again and again. And they've committed according to I think the most recent report I read, over 1,000 violations of the ceasefire terms in Lebanon since that went into effect, and they bomb Lebanon regularly. Now the Iranians cannot let that happen. Lebanon is weak. They don't have air defense. They don't have the ability to really retaliate, but clearly Iran does. And if Israel goes ahead and starts to, give them the Lebanon treatment, Iran has to reply, respond forcefully. I'm assuming they understand that. Let's hope that they do. There's a great deal of anger I hear in Iran over the general naivete, let's say, of Pezeshkian. There's fury. There's the story that we got from Putin that these offers of help were refused. There was there was just this belief somehow that they actually could make peace with the West, including Israel, and I think that should have been put to rest, by the recent surprise attack, and now within Iran, I hear there has been kind of a change in a shift in power. That the Ayatollah Khamenei, went into hiding. When it became clear that he was a possible target for assassination, and he ceded a fair amount of his power. This is what I've read, to the IRGC, and so the IRGC seems to be at least partially taking the reins of government. They've always, been very influential, but they've become even more so. And in general, the hardliners' position has been strengthened, and those of the ones that wanted to appease the West, their position has been greatly weakened for obvious reasons, right? The hardliners were proven to be correct. We've seen a similar process take place within Russia, but this is a more dramatic one. So anyway, if I think probably they're trying to get their own political house in order, and maybe strengthen their ties that had been somewhat weakened by Ceasefire, between themselves and the Russians and the Chinese. It appears that, again, from the statements that Putin himself has made, that he was trying to maintain some kind of distance in the hope of not offending, the Westerners. And that was clearly, a foolish, very foolish policy.
So should we view this ceasefire really just as a pause, that this is just this history won't remember this as the 12-day war? Is that what you're telling us, that this is?
Yeah, well, they might. It depends on how long it goes on. It may take a long time, for example, for the Israelis to build up their stockpiles again. We've talked about the limited production capacity for interceptors above all. I mean, they don't churn out dozens a day. We're talking maybe a dozen in a month or something, for some of these interceptors. If not even that, in some cases, like the THAADs and the SMM3, we're talking about maybe 5 a month. I don't know how many of those were used. But I don't think it's any different. It may even be worse for the arrows. And those turned out to be the most important interceptors in Israel's air defense system. And they I know they have a joint, I think, production facility with Raytheon in the U.S., but I wouldn't be surprised if they can only do something, like similar to what we see in the case of both the SM3s and the THAADs, which is very, very limited. So it could take them a long, long time. I don't think there's any question that they want to, they feel that they failed in their objective. I think people are right when they say the main objective was regime change. I think that's true. I wouldn't completely dismiss the nuclear objective too. Ending Iran's civilian nuclear program. But I think that's secondary. And then we could, we can see that just from, for example, with the history of the JCPOA. They were always against the JCPOA. That was something that severely limited the civilian nuclear program in Iran. It was extensively monitored. There was just um, if that was their main concern, they should have been all for it. And then at least they felt like it could be even stronger. But the obvious approach, if that was your concern, just the civilian nuclear power program, is that okay when it expired, which would have been, I think, this year, because it went into effect in 2015. It was a 10-year agreement, is that you negotiate even stricter terms, right? You have that and you can actually push it a little bit harder. And if that's really what they worried about, the main objective. Now, clearly, by tearing up this JCPOA, and of course Trump did this, but he did it, with the encouragement of the Israelis. They lost those controls, and Iran, after abiding by the agreement for a full year after the U.S. pulled out of it, started to enrich uranium to the 60% level. I think it was clearly as a bargaining chip. And that it was, so, this decision to rip up the JCPOA was completely counterproductive, and it only makes sense if that really wasn't their objective. That controls on the civilian nuclear power plant, very extensive inspections on that civilian nuclear power. If that wasn't their goal, but rather it was regime change. Because by having this let's say inspection regime in place, they lose their main pretext, for an attack on Iran. By tearing up the agreement, they got the pretext again. I think it always was primarily, a pretext for them to attack. Now they're in kind of a tough spot. Well, it's an interesting situation because Trump has very forcefully and repeatedly said that we totally obliterated anything, any sort of statement to the contrary is fake news. He's saying that, Vance is saying that all those people, this is something that they're staking their reputation on. And so it becomes hard for the Israelis to go out and say, oh, this failed. We have to attack Iran again. So I don't know what they're going to do about that. Now, at the same time, there are reports coming, leaks, from the intelligence agencies to major news organizations like CNN in the U.S. that, in fact, the B-2 bomber attacks failed to significantly damage Iran's civilian nuclear program and its enrichment capabilities. That's what we're hearing, from CNN and other major outlets, that it failed. But Trump is vociferously, denying all that. So we'll see, how is Israel going to try to frame this? How are they going to get back into the fight? And, how are they going to try to get the U.S. involved again? Who knows?
Right. Yeah, it's a big problem for Trump if it becomes apparent that Iran's nuclear facilities were not obliterated, as he says. If it was only set back a couple of months. I mean, to be honest, this whole thing between the U.S. and Iran just feels like a song and dance. It seems like we telegraphed where we were going to hit, what we are going to hit, how we're going to do it. I remember watching the news, having little diagrams. Here comes the plane, and it's going to drop it here on Fordow. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it was a secret. Mm-hmm. Iran knew that this was happening. They had time to prepare to remove things. There's this big question about Iran's air defense, like you said, but it seems like it wasn't even engaged. You didn't hear about anything about any of these bombers or these fighters coming under fire. It's all kind of opaque. And then the attack on the U.S. base in Qatar was clearly telegraphed. Yeah. And Trump even said, thank you, Iran, for letting us know ahead of time so we could prepare. No Americans died. It's over. So it's almost
Right.
like this is an agreement because the reality is the U.S. and Iran really don't want to go to war with each other. It's Israel
Yeah.
that's trying to draw this war constantly, and
Right.
so, but now there's this problem that Trump said it's obliterated, and if it becomes clear that it's not obliterated, then what? Do we have to go back to bombing? Because we have stated that this was such a military success because our goal is defined as destroying Iran's nuclear enrichment capabilities, is to
Hmm.
stop Iran from producing a nuclear weapon. But the reality is, did you do that at all? If anything, you've given them a huge incentive to now build the bomb. And if it becomes apparent that that's what they're going to do, then what? If they withdraw from the NPT, is that a trigger for the United States to say, whoops, back to bombing? But then they just look so stupid. Well, maybe you shouldn't have let the JCPOA. Maybe you shouldn't have bombed the Fordo. Like, I don't see how this can end well. And then
Hmm.
Trump is saying, we got this. It's funny because, just him saying that I have the secret intelligence on that Iran is building a bomb. That's why we have to do this. And now all this intelligence is coming out and saying, oh, okay, now it wasn't destroyed, even though he's saying now, no, 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 I got the intelligence, it's obliterated. It's like, well, where is this intelligence? It's just whatever you feel like. It's like your own intelligence agencies say they're not pursuing a nuclear, they don't have a nuclear weapons program, they're not going for a nuke. I got my own intelligence. Okay, now intelligence showing you didn't destroy their nuclear weapons. No, 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 I don't believe it. And Israel is probably going to push for, saying that, oh, they're still pursuing a bomb. You got to get back involved. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, on the intelligence, the reports have appeared saying that that the intelligence that Trump was relying on was coming from Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA, and Kurilla, who was the CENTCOM commander, and they were getting their so-called intelligence directly from the Israelis. So they were just passing it on to him, and he was ignoring U.S. intelligence. The DNI, Tulsi Gabbard, who represents the 17 intelligence agencies in the within the U.S. And again, I've said this before, but I say again, it's not like Tulsi Gabbard was saying something new. This has been stated every year since 2007. This is the consensus. It's been a consensus of, for 18 years within the U.S. Intelligence Committee that they were not working to build a bomb. They had not made that decision. But he decided not to listen to it apparently, and he got his intelligence from these two, from Kurilla and from Ratcliffe, who were getting their intelligence, so-called, from Israel. Now, on the song and dance routine thing, it is a possibility. Clearly, the attack on the retaliation on the base in Qatar by the Iranians was. I mean, like you said, Trump himself said so. That this was all that it was choreographed. It was symbolic, and I think actually on Monday we're discussing the very high possibility that that's what the Iranians would do because they've done that in the past. They don't want war with the U.S. It's not in their interest to bring the U.S. in, and it appears too. We've known this in the past that the U.S. actively cooperated. It's funny, like the one place where finally the U.S. and Iran are on the same page is when it comes to war between their two countries. Neither side really wants it. Um, back in April, there was last year there was True Promise One. Again, it was reported in the Financial Times that the whole thing had been prearranged. And it was telegraphed. It was, the Iranians informed that we're only going to strike these empty places, certain bases, but, not the actual structures, just like the open spaces within an air base, that kind of thing. And that's what they did, right? So we don't have any strong evidence that the U.S. B-2 attack was in fact choreographed. But there is some evidence. There was I don't know how much it's worth, but there was an article that came out from an English Persian news organization based in London. I hadn't heard of it before. but it did say just that this was something that like the Americans had told them in advance, we're doing this and that. And uh, even if they didn't tell them through covert channels, like you said, it was sort of like out on the news. They knew it was coming. And so it may have been kind of prearranged in that sense. Hey, we're going to do this. We're going to drop these bombs on these facilities. Um, just watch Fox News and you'll see what we're going to do. Um, so I don't know. It's certainly possible. Again, they have a history of doing it. So this is not an outlandish, conspiracy theory. It's the two countries have a history of doing this, and they both have very good reasons to avoid war. Of course, the U.S. can do a great deal of damage to Iran, cause a lot of misery and suffering, but Iran, I think the U.S. clearly understands can do a great deal of damage to their military assets in the region, and they would like to avoid that. So it may very well have been just prearranged as sort of a media stunt that allowed, Trump to act tough and to declare victory. Um, yeah, so we'll see. It's just like, but can he do that again after this? This was supposed to be the most incredible mission of all time. It's going to be, how are the Israelis going to try to? Um, I think I think Netanyahu was just sure that he had finally succeeded. His plan, which he's had for years and years, if not decades, to attack Iran and then to bring in the U.S. on his side, that he felt like he had really pulled it off. And now all of a sudden, again, it looks like maybe the rug was pulled out from under him. But he's not given up, just like we've always said, this is an obsession with him. And not just him, but with much of the, I think now probably the IDF. One thing is their reputation is at stake. They put on a brave face, and I think if you watch Western media, this was an incredible victory for Israel. But if much of the world, I'm sure, is seeing the videos that we've seen of the destruction within Israeli cities, and the Israelis have to be aware of that. And it's been a real it's damaged their reputation as this invincible fighting force. They clearly are not invincible, and I think I'm sure that many of those generals are motivated to reestablish that reputation, and they're right now are brainstorming about how they're going to do it.
Right. It seems like everybody is trying to claim victory now. Israel, Iran, the United States. Do we have winners and losers in this so-called 12-day war?
Yeah. Well, it's hard. Again, there's a real fog of war. Like, we don't really know the extent of damage on either side. Clearly, there was a lot of damage that each side suffered. But there was a lot that we just didn't see. Like, we don't know how, to what extent the air defense network in Iran was degraded. We don't know how much damage was done to military bases in Israel, because many of those strikes were actually on military facilities, but because of Israeli censorship, we never got to see it. We just saw what happened within the cities because people have their cameras, and they even ignored, kind of like what still happens in Ukraine. It's against the law to film these strikes, but people just do it and they upload them. You just can't. That's when it seems to be one of the. It's kind of a human urge that cannot be suppressed, to film something with your camera and upload it. So we don't really know the extent of damage. Let's say if we kind of set the surprise attack, the first few hours aside, I would say that it was pretty even, or maybe even give the edge to Iran, but that would be my speculation, not knowing, the full extent of the damage on both sides. If you include that first several hours, again, where so many Iranian generals and nuclear scientists were killed, and a certain number of air defense installations were destroyed, and so on and so forth. And maybe you have to say, well, it's close, but give the edge to Israel. But the thing is, I don't think they can pull that off. That's something they had been planning for a long time. It's sort of like the pager attack. You can do it once. I don't think you can do it again. now the Iranians have woken up to these problems. So the next time Israel attacks, it's not going to be, I don't think, unless they have some sort of new trick up their sleeves, and we can't say that they don't have it. Um, the, you would think that they're not going to have it's not going to have the same effect. A surprise attack is not going to be so much of a surprise if it happens again.
Right. I guess, deciding who kind of so-called won or lost kind of depends on the goals.
Yeah.
And when we look at Israel, like we're saying, the real goal here is regime change to destroy the axis of resistance, install a government that will be uh, bent to the will of the United States and Israel. And that didn't happen. And like you were just saying, really that first shot, that was it. How long have they been preparing for this? They have been all their agents working their way into the IRGC, into the government. And it sounds clear from my understanding. I heard some recordings and I saw reports about this that as this surprise attack was going on, like hundreds, thousands of phone calls and letters went out to members of the IRGC saying that we will kill you and your whole family unless you don't rise up and overthrow the government. And so it was all coordinated. And you can see that in that panic when there are people getting assassinated and,
Hmm.
the airline defenses are offline, it's chaos. And then everybody's getting these messages saying, we know where your family is and we're going to kill your wife and kids. You're like, oh my
Hmm.
God, like that, this was it. This was the chance I think that Israel had. And it didn't happen. So in that case, I think it is really a failure. Like you said, how are they going to be able to pull it off again? And then if they have
Hmm.
a pause and then restart another attack, it's just going to look bad on them because we know what's going on here. You can't keep on playing the same trick again and again. So I
Yeah.
think in that sense, Israel is in real trouble. They didn't achieve regime change. The ability to do it again in the future, uh, it seems slim because instead of having a fracturing of the Iranian political system, we had the opposite. We had it strengthened. We had a rallying around the flag effect.
Hmm.
For the United States, the stated goal is will to wipe out Iran's nuclear program. And this is a big question mark, but it sounds like most analysts are coming to the conclusion that we didn't wipe it all out. First
Hmm.
of all, that this enriched uranium and many of these centrifuges were already probably moved out because, like we said, this attack is telegraphed. So the idea that it's been completely just obliterated, I think, is quite slim. So now the U.S. can only claim victory, and this is why Pete Hegseth and J.D. Vance and Trump are just doubling down. We have to say that we won, so we just keep on holding on this line obliterated. It might work for a couple months, but then at some point in time, this is the big question: will Iran go for the nuke because they're looking okay? They attacked us. They
Hmm.
pulled a sneaky attack on us. We tried playing by the rules. We can't. They look at Libya and they look at North Korea. It's like maybe this is the only way we go, and then it puts the U.S. in a huge bind. They can no longer claim victory. For Iran,
Yeah.
victory, I think, is just surviving. And that's what a lot of people said. The regime didn't collapse, so they can claim victory. So if we look at it in that terms, not just damage, um, it seems clear that Iran won. But then the thing that I think is painful for so many people, including myself, is that for the world and Gaza, nothing has changed. Like this is what people were hoping for. And so when I heard about the ceasefire, I know I should be happy. This was scary. This is something that could spiral out and lead to World War III and unimaginable death and destruction. But I can't help but feel disappointed because I think for so many of us that were watching what has been unfolding in Gaza over the past 21 months, when Iran started striking Israel, that was kind of on behalf of all of us. And I think that's something that the whole world kind of felt that finally there's going to be some justice for all these evil deeds, that we can see the end to this genocide in Gaza, that we can end this destruction. But it doesn't seem like Gaza even entered into the conversation with the ceasefire. It's just forgotten. I mean, the level of carnage that we're seeing in Gaza is just becoming more horrific because these are starving people looking for food, and every day they're just getting gunned down. It's like this is your choice: you starve to death, or you try to go to one of these 8 points and just wait for the IDF to start blasting tank shells or opening machine gun fire into the crowd. It's crazy.
Yeah. Um, Right, I heard more than 500 aid seekers have been killed since the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation began its operations. This NGO that is, according to reports, is Mossad funded, and is clearly being used as a weapon to, you know, work in coordination with the IDF to actually not really to relieve the humanitarian disaster there, but to facilitate ethnic cleansing. It's only down there in the south. There's something I believe a million don't even have access to. A million Gazans don't even have access to the aid that they're providing, which is again far below what's really needed. Um, yeah, it's the whole thing is just it's a cruel charade, and it continued throughout the 12-day war. More than 500 were killed. There was just daily massacres, daily atrocities at these aid sites. Um, and the war unfortunately just seemed to have the effect not of slowing down the these atrocities in any way, reducing them, but rather of just diverting the world's attention from them. So if it wasn't for the war, there may have been actually an increased outcry and increased pressure on Israel to do something. But the whole world was looking, had their eyes turned towards Tehran. Uh, so, even if it gave you some hope that this was going to bring about the end of the Gaza horror, actually in the short term anyway, it was having the opposite effect. And now maybe there will be more focus on what's happening in Gaza, and that the world will continue to turn against Israel.
I think what a lot of people were hoping for, at least myself, was that if it's true that Israel really was wanting the ceasefire, that Iran would put a little bit of pressure on Israel. Stipulation say, okay, well, we will agree, we won't fire any more missiles if you allow more aid into Gaza, or just stop, withdraw from Gaza, just pull. Like, this is, at the end of the day, this is the root cause of everything.
Yeah.
The fact that it just wasn't mentioned, and I just feel like if you're a Palestinian living in Gaza, you see this war, you feel like, oh, finally somebody's coming to save us. That there's being, that this Iran has finally stepped up to the plate. Israel's getting hit. This nightmare might finally end. And then they have this pause, ceasefire, and it's like nothing's happened. We're still starving. They're still shooting us, and it's just like, okay, here we go. Now we're just going to have to watch this grind. And people are saying now, admitting that I think the IDF is using a number that maybe they've gotten vanished 400,000 people. So which sounds like to be honestly a more accurate number. I don't know if that's verified at all, but I just lost my train of thought. But there's just this, you just think that just they're going to continue to slaughter these people, continue to starve them until what? Until this breaks over again, until people have had enough, until Israel strikes Iran again. Like, what are we waiting for? I just want, I want international bodies. I want the United States to just say, stop it, just done. And maybe that's what it's possible. We had this idea that Netanyahu completely owned Trump, and that's how I was feeling. And maybe that's completely true, but it does sound like Trump is pretty upset with Netanyahu. So is there a bit of resistance there? Can he put the pressure and just say, I'm done with you, Israel? Is he aware how close Netanyahu dragged the United States into a complete disaster? I'm sure they sold Trump with, like, we'll do the sneak attack, boom, it'll be over quick and easy, you'll have this big victory parade, regime change. And they probably believed it themselves, because I imagine, like, they've been working on this operation probably for decades, infiltrating it, and then it didn't work, and now Trump is like, okay, now I got this big mess on my hands, and I don't want to have it go any further. Maybe he can turn it around. Yeah. You think it's possible? I don't want to put any hope in Trump, but it's just that's all we have. Okay. That's all we have.
Yeah, I'll answer that. It's a very important question, but let's see. I'll just first go to that study that you mentioned, that there may be, well, I think it was 377,000 actual deaths in Gaza as a result of the war. That was a study that was done by an Israeli professor but in cooperation with an institute at Harvard. And I think it was maybe published through Harvard. So, we're talking about top level researchers. Now, it's based on the IDF's own population estimates. They estimated how many Gazans were in different districts, let's say within Gaza, and it just simply added them up, and it falls 377,000 short of what, the let's say the pre-October 7th total was. So where do those people go? Now, that doesn't prove anything, because, maybe the IDF's estimates are off, right? I don't know, but I imagine these people, I haven't actually read the study. Again, these are high-level researchers, and so they have some reason to have some confidence in the statistics. And I find that statistic actually very believable. We've talked about how the limitations of let's say the Gaza Health Authority figures. These are things that they can verify. People, have actually died in their hospitals, or bodies that have been brought to their morgues, where they have direct evidence. They're actually very careful, and they've been very, very careful, very conservative. But in the chaos and all the destruction that has been meted out to these hospitals, their ability to collect information has greatly diminished. And then there was always the problem of people buried under rubble. And I mean, it was more than half of Gaza is just rubble now. And in that first ceasefire, one of the promises that the Israelis did not fulfill is that they didn't provide equipment for actually clearing the rubble. So we still don't know how many people are under the rubble, or people that were just simply vaporized by the bombs, because that's what happened when a large bomb falls directly on top of you. And then there are all the indirect deaths, right? The people that are dead because the hospital was destroyed and they couldn't get treatment. The people who are malnourished and become sick and then die. All of that, and to say that it was 377,000, I find that a very believable figure. But anyway, let's set that aside. And then there's this other question about Trump. Is Trump actually independent? Is he calling the shots? And I think, we've seen this often enough. I don't think it's a charade. Some people think it's all an act, but there have been these incidents going back where Trump, seems to call the shots. I think he really does, at least in the short run. He gets angry at Netanyahu, which is very easy to do. Other leaders have expressed their frustration at him. They find him a very, very difficult man to deal with. He's constantly stabbing you in the back, for one thing. They understood, these previous presidents and have understood that you just have to hide that. You have to hide your hatred, and because that's policy. They're again just sort of instruments of the policy. But Trump is, for whatever you want to say about him, he's just kind of a more natural figure. He clearly says what's on his mind, and a lot of what's on his mind is just nutty, frankly. But some of it is quite true. One thing is, I think, his annoyance at Netanyahu is something that he can't always hide. And remember that initial ceasefire. That seems to be a time when he put the screws on Netanyahu. But of course, also remember that ceasefire was broken, and that there was kind of an understanding that Netanyahu got out of him, that the ceasefire would be broken in the future. So I don't think we should place a whole lot of confidence. I think we see, again, occasionally in these kind of, in the short run, Trump will assert his independence. But in the long run, it seems like the Zionists get their way. I think it's because, again, Trump is not a strategic thinker. He's very impulsive. And then he has surrounded himself by people that are committed Zionists and who are strategic thinkers. So sometimes he goes off script, but he's got these people around him that are always working to get him back on, get him to continue, going down that road that they had actually designated for him, and to achieve that objective, which they want to achieve, namely the overthrow of the Iranian government. And I think eventually, it won't be I don't know how long this will go on, how long the ceasefire will last, but it won't last forever. And eventually we'll be back at war, and then Trump will be doing their bidding. They will work on him, and they'll get him to do what they want him to do. And Netanyahu will be deploying his assets, and he'll eventually get Trump to re-enter the fight, or at least to support the Israelis in a new wave of attacks.
So that's what we're looking at. Is both sides, Iran and Israel, are just beefing up for round two?
I think so. Yeah, it's hard for me to believe. This has been an obsession with Netanyahu and the Israelis for decades, and I don't think they're going to walk away from this. They're not going to let they achieved only a small fraction of what they hoped to achieve. They failed overall. They're still standing now. The Iranians are angry. The Iranians know what the Israelis are up to. They know about their covert network, and they're rolling it up. And the Iranians also did some real damage. This is not something that the Israelis are going to just let, say bygones be bygones. I can't remember who it was that pointed this out, but if you remember, I guess you don't remember. This was you were just, I don't even know, you weren't even born then, were you? Or maybe you were just a little baby. In the first Gulf War, the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein fired, I think, a total of, I don't know how many, but dozens of Scud missiles into Israel, and not one of them was shot down. Back then, the Israeli and the American air defense technology was really very primitive. There was some sort of pretense at 90% or even 100%, but people really looked at not one was shot down. Now, these missiles really didn't do much damage. They were not very effective. They were very, I think, inaccurate, and they didn't have very large warheads. But it was something that, even so, the Israelis just felt like they could not tolerate. It was a sign of weakness, and back then it was certain Israelis actually just swore vengeance, and eventually we saw what happened to Iraq. There was I think that's actually an important parallel. Stop and look at what happened to Iraq. We had the first Gulf War, but it didn't end, right? The Americans said, okay, yeah, we achieved our objectives. It's all over. But eventually, the true regime change operation went through. Of course, in that case, it took many years. I don't think it's going to be many years in this case.
Could Iran, if they don't want a conflict, do they have a couple of options? One is they could try to pursue the bomb. They'd have to do it in secret, and but I imagine it'll probably leak out that it's happening. And then what does that mean for Israel and the U.S.? Are they going to move quick because the U.S. has staked its whole reputation on that our goal is no nuclear weapon?
Well, it is a dangerous move for them. Yeah, you can understand why they would want to have the bomb for obvious reasons. I don't think we even need to really restate them here. But if they go for the bomb, and the Americans and the Israelis learn about it, that's a huge red flag. That's going to provoke the Israelis, and could very well become the excuse, the pretext for another attack, maybe a joint Israeli attack on a larger scale of Iran. So it's a risky venture. Now, if they can pull it off, they can do it quickly enough before the whole effort is discovered, then clearly they're in a stronger position. Then announce we do have the bomb. I think at that point it's okay, game over. It's just Israel's not going to risk having Tel Aviv nuked.
Is there another option? I actually heard this from Pepe Escobar, that countries like Russia or China, Pakistan, these other nuclear powers in the area don't have to give Iran a nuclear weapon, but they can say that they are under our protection, that we give you sort of a nuclear umbrella, so that Israel or the United States, if you ever think about using a nuclear weapon against Iran, note that, okay, Iran, we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. Nobody wants them to have a nuclear weapon. Iran doesn't want to have a nuclear weapon. It seems like Israel wants them to have a nuclear weapon, so the United States will attack it. That seems to be the only country that wants Iran to go for the nuke almost.
Right.
But if they have that rule, and say that okay, that we would, this Iran is under our protection. You can't touch it, because they're not a nuclear power, but they're now under the protection of nuclear powers.
Yeah. Well, yeah, let's not forget that according to Putin himself, the Russians offered a mutual defense pact similar to what was signed between Russia and North Korea. They offered that to Iran. And Iran refused, incredibly. Pezeshkian refused.
Can it be put back on the table?
Yeah, but that's what I was just going to say is that maybe they could go ahead and actually add those clauses to that strategic partnership agreement that was very recently signed um, and very recently ratified. So, and if that happens, okay, it doesn't, it wouldn't be an explicit promise um, to extend the nuclear umbrella over Iran, the Russian nuclear umbrella, but I think it would be implicit, and it's something that the Israelis and the Americans would have to respect, and they would be, make them very reluctant to actually go to war with Iran if they notice, they understand that they're going to. I don't think they're crazy enough to try it, but we never know. If they attack Iran, they're attacking Russia too, and they could have World War III on their hands. Now, we've already seen like one nuclear facility that was not bombed. It was the Bushehr facility in Iran. It was not attacked by the Israelis or the Americans. And why is that? It's because the Russians are there, working on it. They have engineers there, they have technicians there. And the Russians apparently warned the Israelis, do not, do not attack this facility. Our people are there. So, I mean, if the Russians move in, another thing they can do is actually just like say, okay, we're going to help you rebuild your civilian nuclear program. And we're going to send our, technicians to these different places and help you, effect repairs. There are different things they can do. That's a possibility. So this is what we'll see. Hopefully Pezeshkian has woken up to his mistakes and will encourage this a more a more thoroughgoing strategic partnership. A greater involvement and greater support from the Russians.
So, is this potentially the best case scenario we can look at? Is if that a country like Russia does offer a mutual defense pact with Iran, then that will make the cost of the U.S. going to war with Iran so high that it just won't happen. Yeah. And Israel will also just couldn't do it on its own. So maybe that, we can avoid all this disaster. But then that's great for Iran, great for the region. Well, does this mean the end for Israel if they like that shining jewel that they've always been trying to get has just been pulled out of reach? It's not even on the board anymore because of the protection provided by these superpowers in the region. Is Israel? It almost seems like the raison d'être is to go to war with Iran. What's going to happen if that doesn't? If Iran is protected, and then the axis of resistance is something that is now etched in stone that they can't get rid of. Their dreams of greater Israel may never be realized.
Yeah. Well, yeah. No, it's interesting. It certainly helps Iran. I don't know what the impact would be on Hezbollah and the Houthis and so on and so forth. I guess maybe one reason that the Iranians are somewhat reluctant to kind of to seek Russian support. Well, they already have Russian support, but to intensify that and expand that is that they may feel that it reduces their own scope of action. It does reduce their independence somewhat because the Russians may want them to be more cautious in their support for maybe other members of the Axis. I don't, no way are they going to tell them you got to stop it, but they may, discourage potential offensive actions against Israel.
But it sounds like the Houthis are pretty autonomous. I mean, Iran doesn't seem to like. Lindsey Graham likes to say that it's all directed by the Ayatollah, but from my understanding is that Iran's like, the Houthis, those guys are crazy. They do their own thing. We don't control them.
Yeah. Yeah. They're often described as proxies. Hezbollah, the militias in Iraq and Syria and the Houthis. They're all described as proxies, but they're not. That's an inaccurate description. They are independent entities that receive support from Iran. That's it. They're not. They don't take orders from Iran. And so anyway, I brought up the effect of let's say Russian support for Iran. I don't know if that would have any impact or not. And the Russians may not. I think maybe wouldn't interfere. I mean, there's I may be wrong to suggest that they might try to put the brakes on it. That's one thing that Iran has made clear. It's like in the negotiations with the U.S. Hey, this is between us and as a sovereign nation and these other groups. This is not something that's on the bargaining table. And so I imagine they would say the same thing to the Russians, that they would maintain these relationships no matter what, and the Russians would respect it.
What are you watching for next now? What are you waiting for? Israel to break the ceasefire or something else?
Yeah, well, I think Israel will break the ceasefire. We'll see if they try to give the Iranians the Lebanon treatment. Start violating in the ceasefire in different ways, and we'll see if the Iranians respond forcefully. I think they just have to. They can't let themselves become another Lebanon. There already, I think there was. I saw some report that there was the Israelis had a surveillance drone over Iran, and the Iranians were trying to shoot it down. I don't know if they were successful in that, but that's not clear that it's a violation of the ceasefire, but it could be considered one. We'll see. I think I guess my guess is that we're not going to see anything soon. A real violation, an attempt to launch a new attack. I may be wrong. Maybe again, like this is all just a ruse, and that it's a way. In fact, the Israelis do have stockpiles, and they're hiding this fact. We have to admit that that's possible. We do our best with the information we have, and they're going to actually launch another surprise attack very soon. But if the reports that we're getting are true, and I think they probably are. They are, have severely depleted stockpiles and are not ready for any serious, conflict with Iran. And it's going to take them weeks, probably many, months to reconstitute their forces. So I don't think we're going to see anything soon, but I may be wrong. I think that the ceasefire will last for a while, but it's got to be. Who knows what's at play behind the scenes right now?
It's got to be a tough calculation for Israel, right? I mean, because it seems to be clear that Iran can produce missiles at a faster rate than all of the collective West can be producing the interceptors required to shoot down these ballistic missiles. Right. I mean, we're talking about the production capacities are in the single digits per month. I mean, you have to fire 2 interceptors. I think, I think Patriots, we build a bit more, but I mean, these are also being spread out. Ukraine has been needing a lot of them. We need some ourselves with our bases. It's just, so the longer you give as a respite, the benefit's all going to Iran. Okay. Israel carries out an attack after that. We did it. We stockpiled 200 interceptors. Yeah. Okay. In 24 hours, they're all gone, when Iran retaliates. So I think they have to be thinking hard about it. Like these hard realities have to be hitting the Israelis. I wonder how they're feeling. I'm sure there was this feeling of elation when Trump finally sent those B-2 bombers and like, this is it. The United States is in the fight. They're coming to save us. Woohoo. And then Trump says, okay, now it's over. And now a bunch of Israelis are sitting in the destruction saying, this isn't how it's supposed to end. What now? Right. Because if we start this up again, the U.S. isn't getting hurt because Iran doesn't want to go to war with the U.S. If we start this again, Israel gets hurt. Israel's the one that's just going to continue to get pounded. And if anything, this so-called 12-day war has shown us is that there is a certain amount of resilience in Iran, that they can absorb damage. And even with these sneak attacks, these car bombings, assassinations, you didn't achieve it. And the ability to continue that level of operation, because that seemed to be really the most damaging thing. And then it's kind of unclear exactly what was being done in damage in Tehran via, the Israeli Air Force, or was it on the ground drones and car
Hmm.
bombings and assassinations? Um, so yeah, I feel like the Israelis got to be feeling upset, and then this is going to put a lot of pressure on Netanyahu. It's like, whoa, good job, buddy. Look at the state of Israel now.
Yeah, no, no, it's interesting. I mean, this is this was probably their best shot. They'll never have a shot like this again, and to all appearances, they failed.
And they have to be thinking hard about it, like we're
Yeah,
thinking about it. They got to come
right,
to that conclusion. Some of them,
right.
right?
Yeah, yeah, but at the same time, you have Netanyahu, who is also thinking, damn, now he got a boost. I mean, these 12 days were great for him, because even the left supports, by a slim majority, supported the war against Iran within Israel. So there was this rally around the flag effect there, but it's going to have to wear off quickly, and he's going to be faced with the same domestic problems that he was faced with before, and probably they will intensify those. Now it seems, by and large, the Israelis are not questioning the attack on Iran, but I think as the days goes by, they will begin to, and it'll just add to Netanyahu's troubles. And then, but that just gives again Netanyahu an incentive to attack Iran again, just recklessly. But can he? That's the big question. Can he?
Right. And well, the more he attacks Iran, the more destroyed Israel becomes until the point of failure. So it's like they're just banging their heads out up against the wall with this, But
Right.
it
Well, it
seems
looks
like
like it's
that's the
finally,
only
but
thing.
it was a bridge too far. I mean, all these other countries, let's not forget Iraq. Of course, that really was done by the Americans, but I think as Mearsheimer demonstrated in his book with Stephen Walt, the Israel lobby, the Israelis were in very large part responsible for that attack on Iraq, the 2003 war. That it was their people, sometimes dual citizens at high levels of the American government, but other, you could say, Israeli assets that. In the end, I don't think you can say that it was all the Israelis. There were Americans who are not, just Israeli assets who wanted to do this. That's clear. But the Israelis helped to bring it about, and that war was successful, and you could see the success. What it actually meant to, like, this war effort. Their planes were able to fly across Iraqi airspace unimpeded and go right up to the border with Iran and fire their missiles from there. Now, if Iraq was still an independent country, not really under the thumb of the U.S. and Israel, that would not have been possible. Um, so this is an interesting question. This is another thing that can happen in the long run, and is maybe to the detriment of the Israelis. Maybe Iraq will, reassert its independence. Now there are several American military bases within Iraq, but beginning, I believe, in October, the U.S. is going to start withdrawing forces from at least some of those bases, and we'll see if the Iraqis, are able to pressure, again, to reestablish their sovereignty, and once again gain control of their own country. And if they do, it's that airspace is no longer going to be, available to Israel and to the U.S. But that may take years. I think it's an eventuality, but it may take years. But again, that's another place where the clock is ticking, and it's ticking against Israel.
Yeah, when Israel did that attack after True Promise 2, we had reports that the U.S. was doing air refueling. Do we know if the U.S. was carrying out these air refueling operations for the IDF as it was launching these air raids, or were they doing this completely? I mean, not, I know they're using intelligence maybe from us, but
Yeah.
for the most part, were they doing this by
Yeah,
themselves?
that was a question that was never answered. I think a lot of people assumed that probably we had to be involved because the Israelis just don't have that capacity. But we never got clear evidence on that. Um, we did get some evidence that actually the Germans, incredibly, were helping out the Israelis. There was I think, a German air refueling tanker that had turned on its transponder for somebody, and there it was over Iraq. And so if the Americans were not involved, it certainly appears that the Europeans were.
Hmm.
Yeah, and they were very much involved in other ways. There's no question about it.
Right.
It
Definitely in the
yeah,
defense.
yeah.
Yeah, it
Well,
makes me
defense,
wonder.
yeah, but the intelligence the importance of that cannot be overrated. Again, the U.S. has, quite an array of satellites, of reconnaissance, intelligence gathering satellites, that Israel does not have, and so they're dependent on that intelligence that comes from the U.S.
Right. Yeah, just looking at this, it's when I talk about who's the winners and the losers, it's hard to see Israel as coming anything positive coming out of this for them. Is there anything that you could say that was a potentially a win for Israel? I mean, for me, it seems like their economy got shattered, their infrastructure is severely damaged, but more importantly, just like you said, that aura of invincibility has been completely shattered, and the ramifications of that, I think, are going to be devastating to Israel, just to the psyche of the Israeli people, the desire to emigrate to Israel and invest in Israel, all that stuff we talked about is gone. So
Mm-hmm.
it just sounds like they're in a real pickle. Like they didn't achieve anything, but that the PR war as well. I think there were so many people that were just raising the alarm bells and saying like, why are we doing this for Israel? It's so clear that the U.S. is getting dragged in because of Israel. So this whole
Mm-hmm.
idea of Israel controlling the United States has gone mainstream, and that's a death knell in Israel for itself
Yeah,
in the long run, just this awakening.
right.
So just everything I look at is a disaster. But the problem is it almost seems like Israel is going to they want to lash out. It's not easy for them to, so they're going to take it
Right.
out on the people of Gaza. And that's what seems like what's happening. They're upset that they're not able to get their licks in and start World War III. So let's just keep on blowing up children in Gaza.
Yeah, well, yeah, I don't know if I really have anything to add to that. I think you're right about that. I mean, yeah, they'll want to go back to Iran, and unless we've been lied to about the state of their military and of their stockpiles, that they simply can't. Not in the next few weeks. It'll be at least months. That's it appears to me now. Um, Again, maybe they have another trick up their sleeve. We just don't know. But it seems doubtful. I think that they, exposed their hand and in the surprise attack. Yeah, no, again, there is this big difference. I think if you look at a lot of Western media, you would have the sense that this was just an incredibly successful effort on the part of Israel, and the Iranians were exposed as being very, very weak, and um, but the Israelis themselves, who know what happened to their cities, and much of the world that has seen these videos and sees Iran standing and surviving this attack. Iran. The hope is that Iran would be another Syria. It wasn't, and it certainly doesn't. It's not. I guess it's not over. There are probably still those covert assets within Iran, but everything that we've seen so far is that the Iranians, even if there are going to be future assassinations, up to including the supreme leader, the Iranians will weather those attacks and will probably grow stronger. That's what we've seen so far.
Okay. Well, it sounds like probably what we're looking at is we're going to see political pressure build on Netanyahu in the coming days, weeks, maybe even months, as the destruction to Israel is being laid bare to the Israeli people. And that's probably going to push Netanyahu to stay in power. What do you do? Let's Bobby Run again. Let's break the ceasefire, keep it going, right? That's his only card that Netanyahu has to play, right? If things get bad, well, time to escalate, time to invade another country, time to, do some very provocative act, right?
Yeah, well, yeah, that could be what happens again. It's just that the logic of it. I guess there's this other logic, okay, that we've always talked about, is that okay, we get into a shooting war with Iran, and then we start losing, and then the U.S. has to come in, and maybe this is. I think that was always there as a plan B or plan C or something. I think there's no question, but that hasn't gone away. It's just like, yeah, that's a pretty difficult road to go down. It's just see you have your own country really pummeled, and hope. Again, you have this very mercurial, unpredictable guy, Trump. That he'll come to your aid in a big way. Um,
Right.
and but he may go for it. That's true. It's just like he may actually like start launching attacks or severe provocations against Iran, even knowing that they don't have the sufficient interceptors and missiles to sustain a war against them. But then bet on the fact that like when they really do have their backs against the wall, that the U.S. will come in. Now, that's a dangerous bet. It could very well work out. Unfortunately, but again, with Trump, it just may be that he'll come down like a ton of bricks on Netanyahu and say, ceasefire, man. You shouldn't have done that.
Hmm.
And then where is Netanyahu? That could be the end of his
Right.
career. So these are all
Right.
possibilities.
Just more destruction. Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, Israel is just. I mean, they're not acting in their own self-interest at all. It's just they have this obsession. I mean, they have no desire to be a normal country. It's just it's like
Yeah,
they're going up to this big guy and picking a fight with him, just sucker punching him, then turn around and get hit a few times, and then hope that the U.S. comes into the fight. But that willingness to get hit, like, do you really want that? You really want that? Like, and hope that we come to the back you up? That's all they're hoping. And now everybody knows that that's the plan, that the U.S. is supposed to come in. When we all know it's like, dude, don't punch him. Don't
yeah,
stop picking this fight.
yeah,
And he's got to be scared. All right, we're going to do this again. And then Israel's going to start getting pummeled again. Like, okay, I'm getting hit. Can come in and save me now,
yeah,
America. America's like, well, we just told you, don't punch the guy. Just
yeah.
stop doing it. Why do we have to
Right.
keep doing this
Uh-huh.
charade?
Yeah,
It's a charade. It's crazy.
yeah. No, you're right.
Okay, well, I guess we can end it there.
Okay.
Anything else you want to say, Dad?
No. Yeah, one of these days we'll get back to the other parts of the world, like Ukraine. But yeah, this deserves our attention now, and I think we've covered it adequately for today.
Okay, what do you think the odds are that let's see, we'll talk again on Friday. What do you think the ceasefire will hold?
I think the odds are that it would, but I just, who knows? It may turn out that the thing was a ruse. We have to be, we have to understand that, and I think the Iranians understand that too. It's just don't say, oh, okay, now we can breathe a sigh of relief and relax for at least, a few weeks. It may be that, Netanyahu is going to go back into this right now. He's going to get some intelligence that he knows where Khamenei is, and he's going to strike him because this is his chance for this provocation that he was hoping for, or whatever. We'll see.
Yeah. Okay, one last thing. Do you think, we're talking about Israel breaking the ceasefire. Do you think that there's a real possibility that instead Israel might go the false flag route?
Yeah, there's always a chance of that. There certainly is. Again, it's dangerous, I think, especially with Trump as president. Now, of course, the most famous false flag, I have to admit it hasn't been proven to be a false flag, but I think almost certainly was the USS Liberty incident. And the president at that time was Johnson, and he just went along with it. He covered it up. He told all the survivors from the USS Liberty to be silent, not to say anything about it, because they all knew it was the Israelis that were doing it, and they did it knowingly. I don't think they can have the same kind of confidence that this president is going to provide them that kind of cover. I mean, that's the thing you can say for Trump. He does so many things that I absolutely hate and frankly, disgust me. But I don't think he's reliable in that way. He is more of a real person who I think will respond viscerally, emotionally to something like that if he discovers it, and will truly be angry and just may not cover for Israel. And so it would be a dangerous move on their part.
Right. I think there's a high chance of failure for a false flag because I think a lot of people are onto Israel now.
Yeah,
There's a big voice of opposition saying, "Wait, everybody be wary of false flags. This is something a little sketchy." And because it's just if you're just looking at it objectively, it's clear that Iran does not want to attack the United States. They're going out of their way to prevent any type of casualties. Just like,
Hmm.
Trump said, thank you, Iran, for letting us know of your, your demonstrative attack. So nobody's hurt. So I just don't think it'll fly, but I am worried, Israel doesn't have a lot of options. They're,
Yeah.
they obviously the real option is to just have a normal society and country that has borders that are recognized by the world. Let's go back to the 1967. Let the Palestinians have a state, right? That's the only really way out. But obviously, that for them, that's a
Yeah.
no brainer. So the only option for them is escalate, bring America into this war. So
Yeah. No,
let's just see what happens.
Yeah. Right. Well,
But
that
we're
seems
on
like
to them. That's the thing is everybody's on to Israel. So it's just
right.
like, sorry guys, the jig's up.
Yeah. Well, again, there's just overall just increased cynicism and I think realism among the American public. And there's a huge contrast between like the levels of support for this most recent attack and of previous attacks. And in fact, a majority were against this attack, which is really quite remarkable because typically it's just like 90%. Everybody rallies around the flag every time our boys do something. And now among Republicans, it has to be said, there was strong support. It wasn't off the chart support, but it was strong support, something on the order like 70% or something, which is overall, though, it was there was opposition to it.
Yeah, I think on the Republican side, there's just people that just have this, we have to support our military, and that's their
Yeah,
doctrine. They may not actually support the attack on Iran
yeah.
or
But I
anything.
think too that Trump understands, this is where Trump is smart. The reason he understands his base, his support is for these kind of stunts. It's not for an actual war, and that's what he did. He did it, pulled off a stunt. It was the most awesome stunt or mission in the history of the American military and world history, et cetera, et cetera. But then it's over, and everybody, especially on the Republican side, there is a large majority that supports that. And I think it helped him overall with his base, with some obvious exceptions, some people, thinking people like Tucker Carlson. Um, but he has to stop there. See, that's where he is. So his incentives are really in conflict with Netanyahu's motivations, right? And so that makes for a very interesting thing. Again, the problem is that all those people, there's so many people that are in sync with Netanyahu. Not all of them, but a lot of people around Trump who are really on Netanyahu's team and want to see this war restarted. But I think people like J.D. Vance, sometimes it's the nature of politics. When you become part of an administration, you have to be part of the team. But I think he was probably somebody who said, okay, yeah, Trump do this, but then we just stop it there. That'll be great for you. And, we do this, we declare success and everybody will love you. And then we get out of there. So there are going to be people that are around him, influential people who have his ear that are going to be saying, don't fall for these guys. Don't go back into this. Okay, what you did was great. Just leave it there. So we'll see who wins.
Right. Yeah. Well, I do feel like there is just some kind of mass awakening happening in the United States, and that should help, pull Trump back. Hopefully, if his base continues to speak up against this war with Iran, then maybe there's some hope there. I mean, we live here in the Bible Belt, a very Zionist country overall, but I think even here the mood has shifted. I think even evangelical Christians, I think, are having some trouble stomaching what Israel's doing in Gaza and just the blatant, attempt to draw the United States in the war. I just took my son to daycare this morning, and that little, I drive under this little bridge, and on the bridge, I noticed this morning somebody spray painted "Free Palestine"
I saw
on the
that.
bridge. You saw that too?
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
So it's like, wow, even here, it's like that's something that you would never have seen, 5 years ago or anything like this. People are aware now, and so even in the South where you have the Christian Zionist stronghold, I think
Right.
it's just
Yeah. Yeah. Again, we've said this before, but it's really important that Okay, even among young conservatives, young Republican leaning voters, there has been a real shift away from Israel. I think it may even be a majority, or it's a near majority of young Republican leaning voters are actually have a negative view of Israel. So that's
Mm-hmm.
huge. Again, it's just like whatever happens in the short run, in the long run, it looks very bad for Israel.
Right. I think this is why this conflict is so fascinating for everybody because everybody feels part of it. We're involved. We're attached to it. Israel is attached to the United States. So that just means that, this is a conflict and just the whole Western world, Western hegemony, this whole multipolarity versus the hyper power, the Western hegemonic power. It's just this. Everybody's involved in this conflict, so we're all attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's on a side, and it seems like everybody's clear on one side, even within the United States. And sometimes I wonder, am I being anti-American because I'm rooting for multipolarity? I almost feel like I try to stay as impartial as possible, but clearly I have a bias. I
Mm-hmm.
am on the side of the multipolar world. I don't want to see the U.S. empire continue to expand. I don't think it's good for America.
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah,
that
well,
makes
if
me
you
a
don't think it's
patriot.
good for him, that's true patriotism. You want what's good for America, and yeah, global hegemony is not good for America. Whether you look at it in terms of our reputation, our economic prosperity, or the military. In the end, it's bad. We're overstretched. We have committed ourselves to conflicts that are in the end destructive. Of our to the detriment of our own interests. And so, if we believe in our own interests, we should really pull back and become a normal nation again, just like Israel needs to become a normal nation.
I think I think there's no hope for Israel. I
Yeah,
hope there's hope for the United States.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay, Dad. All right. Well, that was a long one, so I think we can go ahead and call it a day.
Okay.
All right. Thanks a bunch. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll
Okay.
talk
You
to you
too.
soon. Yeah. Bye bye.